I met Don McMillan in prison before I ever met him. When Barry and I moved in here, everything was shut down. We moved in right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was reading the newsletter, Don McMillan's Musings. One of the reasons why I knew we'd moved to the right place, because we have people here who have retired, but they've kept their brains at work, being curious about all kinds of things and sharing them with us. That's what I love about Saturday Matters. And Don McMillan has always given us some really interesting stuff within his field and out of it, well researched. So I'm interested to hear what he's going to tell us about one of our local controversies, somewhat under the radar, but coming to more general attention, about the Duwamish and Muckleshoot dispute. Okay, let's go, Don.
Thank you. What I want to do this morning is not only present the viewpoints of the two tribes, but also go back in history and talk a little bit about how we got here. And that's going to require going back some 170 years in history. I think if you looked at the local newspaper in 2022, there were numerous references to what was going on with this conflict. And so I want to cover this material as best I can. It's not easy to recover it. A lot of the information is not accurate. In the 1800s, there was very little information about tribal identity and tribal governance. Currently, the tribes are in conflict, so the information that they're putting on the internet is biased, with each tribe presenting its own point of view, almost propaganda in many cases. Furthermore, government records regarding the treaties between the United States and Native American tribes isn't always very accurate. The federal government was anxious to complete the signing of these many treaties in the middle 1850s. And they didn't always verify who was signing for whom. A case in point, it is generally accepted that Chief Seattle signed for a lot of tribes for which he had no real relationship. Now, there are 29 federally recognized Native American tribes in the state of Washington. And one of the most prominent, and one might say successful tribes, are the Muckleshoots. There are a number of other tribes in Washington that have a long history. They're prominent, but they have not been recognized by the federal government as tribes. And one of the most prominent in the Seattle area is the Duwamish. And my discussion is going to focus on what happened to these two tribes starting in the middle 1800s and then going up to the present day. Before the whites came into this area, the Native Americans in Seattle were divided into two main groups, the names of which translate into English as the people of the inside. Those were the ones that were settled primarily along Elliott Bay, and the people of the large lake, obviously referring to Lake Washington. After the arrival of the whites, these two groups came together under the general name of the Duwamish. The Duwamish consisted of a number of sub-tribes with other tribal names. In the middle of the 1800s, at least 6 of these sub-tribes united into the Duwamish tribe, with Chief Seattle as their nominal head. Contact with the tribes before the Treaty of 1855. By the middle of the 19th century, the tribes had been pretty well decimated by disease, and European settlers were taking over the traditional lands and preventing hunting and fishing in traditional forests and lakes. In an attempt to stop white colonization and to express dissatisfaction with the Treaty of Medicine Creek, which occurred in 1854, the Nisqually tribe fought a battle with government troops initiating the Puget Sound Indian War, and a number of tribes joined the Nisqually tribe, including the Muckleshoot tribe. And the war ended in defeat for the tribes, and what followed was the Treaty of Point Elliott. Now, what was the Treaty of Point Elliott? Well, this was signed in 1855. It is the land settlement treaty between the United States government and Native American tribes of the greater Puget Sound region in the recently formed Washington Territory. Remember, at this time, Washington was not a state, it was a fresh territory. The treaty was signed at Point Elliott, now Mukilteo, and ratification of the treaty occurred March 3rd, 1859 by the United States Congress. Signatories to the Treaty of Point Elliott included Chief Seattle, Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens, and a number of other tribal chiefs, in fact, quite a large number. Now, Chief Seattle, his mother, was from the White River Band of the Duwamish tribe, and his father was Suquamish. The treaty established Suquamish, Fort Madison, Tulalip, and Lumi reservations. It was not until December of 1856, after the signing of the treaty, that a reservation was established for the Muckleshoot tribe. Reservations were not designated for the Duwamish, Skagit, Snohomish, and Snoqualmie peoples. How am I doing on pronunciation of these names? Are they recognizable? Okay, so the treaty has been signed, and a point that I'd like you to remember as we get deeper into this that was the title of the treaty. I'll bring it up again, but the treaty was between the United States and the Duwamish, Suquamish, and other allied and subordinate tribes of Indians in the Washington Territory. So no Duwamish in the actual title of the treaty. Now here is a designation of this treaty that was placed here by the Daughters of the American Revolution. I don't know how well you can see what it is, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. At this place on January 22nd, 1855, Governor Isaac I. Stevens concluded the treaty by which the Indians ceded the lands from Point Pulley to the British boundary. Of the 100 signatures, 82 were by Indian chiefs, headmen, and delegates of numerous tribes. The first 4 recognized as leading chiefs of their own and allied tribes were Seattle, Patcanic, Gullah, and Chowashoot. The United States Senate ratified the treaty on March 8, 1859, and this was erected by the Marcus Whitman chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution of Everett, Washington. And you can go there and see this marker. Well, in later years, it was very important for the tribes to obtain formal recognition from the United States government. The reason for this, recognition as a tribe, allowed the tribe to have direct interaction with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs then could supply benefits to the Native Americans, particularly those on reservations. And an important point is that if you were not on a reservation, it was much more difficult to get interactions with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. and to achieve any of the benefits that they could supply to Indians on the reservations. Well, how do you get status as a recognized tribe? Well, there's a long series of steps, but two very important ones, very important for what I have to say today. The tribe must have maintained its distinct tribal identity over time. And secondly, they must have historical recognition as having formed a tribal government, and that also must have been maintained over time. Now, the Muckleshoot tribe, which I'll be discussing first, met these requirements. They formed a constitution which was approved by the Secretary of the Interior in 1936. In the 1960s, the federal courts recognized the Muckleshoots as descendants of the Duwamish. So, what about the Muckleshoot tribe? In the early 1900s, almost all of the land on the Muckleshoot reservation was allotted to tribal members, but poverty caused the sale of much of that land to outsiders, and tribal land ownership disappeared almost completely. A relatively small number of acres constituted the reservation. Renewed fishing rights, the Bolt decision, revitalized the tribe, and it began to grow, and reservation land began to be reacquired. So what's this Bolt decision about? If any of you are salmon fishermen, you know about the Bolt decision because it still governs fishing in this area today. Well, initially, white settlers had very little interest in development of the fishing industry. They were much more concerned with the development of roads and setting up government and farming and getting the railroads in and so forth. But in the first half of the 20th century, this changed with the development of commercial fishing and fish canneries in Seattle. These developments brought the federal government and the state governments into conflict with each other, and a complaint was filed by the federal government against the state of Washington on the behalf of the tribes. The complaint, titled United States versus the State of Washington, was filed in the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington on behalf of the United States as trustee for 7 tribes against the state of Washington. Another 7 tribes later joined the action, and the Washington Department of Fisheries and several other state agencies were later added as defendants. The case took nearly 3 years to wind through discovery and pretrial motions before the trial finally began in Tacoma on August 27, 1973, with Judge George Bolt presiding. 49 witnesses testified, 350 exhibits were administered during trial, which was held without a jury. So that meant that the final decision was going to be made by Judge Bolt. Hence it's typically referred to as the Bolt decision. Well, what was the main point of the Bolt decision? On February 12, 1974, Federal District Judge George Bolt dramatically altered the Puget Sound salmon fishing industry. Bolt ruled that under the terms of the Treaty of Point Elliott, certain Indian groups had retained title to 50% of the Western Washington salmon resource. In making this interpretation, Bolt overturned the rules that had structured the development of commercial salmon fishery in the state of Washington, which had been managed previously as a common property resource of the citizenry since statehood. Following the Bolt decision, salmon fishery was divided into 2 commercial fisheries: the all-citizen fishery, where anyone could go, and the treaty tribe fishery, where only the Native Americans could fish. The Muckleshoot tribe was a beneficiary of this decision, and the tribe began to recover economically. So the Muckleshoot tribe, from being almost destitute and having lost most of their lands, now began to rise to promise. Following the bold decision, they began to recover. An important cause of the recovery was from the salmon fishing and the leasing of some fishing rights to other groups. Profits were dedicated toward the development of a gambling casino on reservation land, also heavily involved in bingo games. On April 26, 1995, the tribe opened a 13,000 square foot gambling tent, which served until a casino building was built. The current casino is 340,000 square feet and is undergoing major renovation and expansion to develop the Muckleshoot Reservation as a resort destination. And the casino has now become the major source of Muckleshoot prosperity. Currently under construction on the reservation is an 18-story, 400-room resort hotel with 3 restaurants and a cultural center, which is scheduled to open this year. Actually, it's been delayed. It was supposed to open in 2021 and then 2022, and now it's supposed to open this year. Annual revenue from that casino is approximately $265 million per year. The reservation itself has now expanded to 4,000 acres, and the tribe has purchased an additional 105,000 acres of woodlands in the state of Washington. And the Muckleshoot Casino is the official casino of the National Hockey League, so you can see some acceptance by the white community. Well, now where is this reservation? It's very close to Auburn. This is a modern map. You can see the routes on it. And here we can see the White River, and it's not a perfect squares like this, but this area runs along the White River, and there is also some expansion of the reservation into the Green River area. So we're looking at a considerable area now. Here's the entrance to the Muckleshoot Reservation. You can see it's a substantial building. If you go on to reservations in the state of Washington, a lot of small buildings are there, but very few that are as impressive as this one. Here is the artist's rendition of the building under construction, the big hotel that is supposed to open this year. Here is the present reservation, part of the area inside with the slot machines. Down you see that there's a photo taken now and then an earlier photo, and you can get some indication of how the elegance of the reservation buildings have developed over the past few years. Well, the tribe has accomplished a great deal. They now have 3,300 employees, a great many of which are not tribal members. They have a school system. The Reservation High School has a graduation rate of 87.5%, much higher than the Seattle schools, although we don't have terribly much data on what happens to them after graduation. Tribal banks have provided $110 million in home loans to tribal members. There is a tribal health center, health and wellness center, concentrating on dental health, diabetes, diet, pharmacy, and general medicine. They have a board that provides housing, building permits, and governs all land use on the reservation. The tribe contributes about $3 million annually to local government, schools, churches, and nonprofits, and that is largely contributions that are made outside the reservation. They contribute funds to programs for Native American homeless. So you can see that this is a rather prosperous Native American community. Okay, now who are these Duwamish people? Where did they come from? Well, remember that there was no reservation for the Duwamish. So most members of the original Duwamish didn't go to the reservations. And they had no reservation, so they integrated with the white settlers of the area. And many of these people were female and married non-Indians. Now, early maps show a Duwamish territory separate from and adjacent to the Muckleshoot territory, suggesting that the Duwamish tribe had a tribal identity that was quite separate from the Muckleshoot. And again, I need to, what did I do? Put it in my pocket. I need to point out where some of these are, and I'll have to yell because I'm not going to take the microphone. With me. So we're looking down in this quadrant. Here is the Duwamish area, primarily along the White River. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can see it too.
And you can see the Muckleshoots are adjacent to that area. The Nisqually are over here. That would explain the proximity and the relationship between the Muckleshoots and the Nisqually. So we're looking at an area that is clearly separate, that these tribes have some differential identity, at least at this early period in time. Well, they have their cultural center too. In fact, if you were here about 5 years ago, I've been here 6, and one of our trips was actually to go down to the Duwamish Cultural Center and spend about an hour going there. As you can see, it's got a museum, a gift shop, a small art gallery, and it's available for rent and so forth. Not quite the grandeur that we saw with Muckleshoots. This is the outside of the longhouse. Parking would be over at that small end. There's a parking lot there that I didn't show. Here's the inside of the longhouse where they meet to have their tribal activities. And here's a picture of the tribal members being addressed by the current chief of the tribe. Well, this longhouse was built in the early 2000s at a cost of about $3.6 million. That was used for acquisition of the land and construction of the longhouse. It's located at 4105 Marginal Way, and I think many of you are familiar with Marginal Way and where it runs south of the city. It's across from a small open plot of land upon which a large Duwamish village once stood. Now this $3.6 million of funding came largely from private sources. In addition to that, from the I believe there are about 600 people that are registered in the Duwamish tribe. Now, this is a slide I showed you before. Remember the treaty between the United States and the Duwamish, Suquamish, and other allied and subordinate tribes of Indians in Washington Territory. That's the original title of the treaty of 1865. And of course, there was no reservation for the Duwamish people. Well, by 1865, this is 10 years after the signing of that treaty, the Donation Claims Act and the Homestead Act prevented Native Americans from purchasing land in Seattle, leading to the dispersal of Native Americans not on reservations. So a large section of the Duwamish just integrated into the general population of the area. In 1866, Indian agent Thomas Gage recommended the Duwamish be given a reservation, but white residents blocked it through the efforts of Representative Arthur Denny. Now Arthur Denny's quite a hero in the development of the early years of Seattle, a little less so for the interaction with the Native American population. And in fact, in 2010, his great-great-granddaughter offered a formal apology to the Duwamish for his actions. Well, let's now look at some of the material. This isn't things that I put together like the first part of the talk has been, but this is rather taken directly from what the Duwamish have put on the internet. They say when white settlers arrived at Alki Point 170 years ago and began to build what would become a city called Seattle, on the land we now know as King County, they found at least 17 villages with nearly 100 buildings among them that were home to a rich community of interconnected families known together as people of the inside. I think once again referring to those that were along the Sound, the Duwamish. They had lived on this land for more than 12,000 years. But in just 3 years, the Duwamish would be forced off their ancestral land by our federal government with the promise of a reservation that was never delivered. Their villages were attacked and their longhouses burned. A law was passed banning them from being the city of Seattle, a city named after their own chief, after sundown. Their ancestral rivers, once abundant with salmon, were drained dry. Their children were forced into boarding schools that sought to smother their language and culture. Today, the U.S. government claims the Duwamish tribe ceased to exist many years ago, but the truth is that the Duwamish are still here, in this city that bears the name of their late chief, despite every attempt to eradicate their people and erase their culture over the last 17 decades. And they demand to be recognized. Click on the blue to find more details about the Duwamish tribe, and I didn't bother to blacken the blue. More from the Duwamish site on the internet. The Duwamish tribe is the true successor of the Duwamish who signed the Treaty of Point Elliott. Chief, I won't try to pronounce that, Seattle, was listed as chief of the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes, and 3 other Duwamish subchiefs signed their names to the treaty as well. Our leadership has been unbroken since treaty times. And now note that point, unbroken, because that's one of the things that they need to have formal recognition. We successfully petitioned the government for a settlement in 1925 and received a positive judgment in our favor. We were recognized by Congress as the Duwamish tribe, receiving a settlement from the government in the form of $64 per tribal member in 1971. Land prices in Seattle are a little higher these days. Now, this is in italics because this is something I added at this point. The Department of Indian Affairs did not recognize this settlement as a formal recognition of the Duwamish tribe. So even though Congress had done this, the Department of the Interior, which oversees Indian Affairs, did not recognize the settlement. We began our efforts to restore our formal recognition with the government in 1978. We received acknowledgement in 2001 by the Clinton administration, but it was immediately reversed by the Bush administration in 2002. Now, I don't know the basis for either of those decisions. I don't know why the Clinton administration recognized them, and I don't know why it was reversed by President Bush, although perhaps they were trying to reverse everything that he did. Okay, the Duwamish's fight for federal recognition does not depend on whether the Duwamish petitioners descend from historical Duwamish Indians. Evaluators of the genealogy have found that most of them do. Instead, the fight is over whether this group maintained a distinctive Native American identity and community, and that identity and community exercise political influence and authority over its members. Just saying in a little, two different phrases, a little different words, the two main points that are needed for recognition, formal recognition as a tribe. That distinguishes them as an Indian tribe from a voluntary association of Native American descendants. There are about 600 people registered by the tribe, and it's in quotation marks because it depends who you're talking to, whether or not they're a tribe. The current chairwoman of the Duwamish is the great-great-grandniece of Chief Seattle. So a direct line going to Chief Seattle, who was the principal authority at signing for the people in that area. Now, tribal leadership, have they maintained it? Start with Chief Seattle. There's some debate about at what point he became chief and exactly who he was chief over at what periods of time. But this was probably in the 1820s or early 1830s to 1866, followed by Chief Stoda, Chief Rogers, Chief Peter James, Chief George James, Chief Moses, Chief Ruth Scranton, the first woman chief of the tribe, Chief Bill, and the current chief, Cecil Hansen. So, according to the Duwamish, they have had a government with a chief since well before the signing of the Treaty of 1855. Well, Judge Bolt got involved again. In the 1970s, the Duwamish embarked on a renewed attempt at government recognition with a court ruling to be made by Judge Bolt. The ruling by Judge Bolt in 1979 denied the Duwamish recognition because no tribal records were available from 1915 to 1925, indicating they were not a tribe maintained over time. So here we're looking at a period from well before the signing of the treaty to the present, and the main decision made by Bolt was that there's a 10-year period when no records were maintained. And this bold decision meant that no government recognition would occur, and all the things that might have gone with that, such as fishing rights under the original bold decision on fishing, no connection to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, etc., etc., etc. The Duwamish continue this fight for recognition right up to the present day. And you probably saw in the newspapers the Department of the Interior ruling on reinstatement as a recognized tribe. The Duwamish tribe's decades-long quest to gain federal recognition hit a massive roadblock in 2022 as the United States Department of the Interior issued its final decision denying such recognition to the tribe. In a letter to Cecil Hanson, tribal chairwoman, the Department of the Interior said it had determined the Duwamish is not entitled to be acknowledged as an Indian tribe within the meaning of federal law. And it emphasized that this was the final decision for the department. We don't want to hear about this anymore, I think is what they're saying. Now, benefits of federal recognition include funding for housing, education, health care, possibility of land for a reservation, and the possibility for establishing a casino. The federal government for Indian Affairs has an annual budget of about $43 billion, so there's a lot of money to support this. The Duwamish claim that much more important than the benefits from the Bureau of Indian Affairs is the recognition of their heritage and the right to live on the land in the area where their ancestors lived and died. So the Duwamish did not accept this decision, and on May 11th, 2022, less than a year ago, they filed a lawsuit against the Department of the Interior in the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington to secure its tribal sovereignty that predates the founding of the United States. For the past 167 years, the Duwamish tribe has fought for promises made by the United States in the Treaty of Point Elliott signed in 1855 by Chief Seattle on behalf of both the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes. Based on the recognition of the Duwamish tribe by Congress, several U.S. courts, and numerous other authorities, the tribe seeks a judicial declaration that it is a recognized tribe. Now, something different that has appeared in this last thing that maybe gives them another attack point is they say, based on the department's differential treatment of the Duwamish tribe on the basis of sex, as a matrilineal tribe whose present-day membership descends primarily from Duwamish women, the tribe seeks a judicial determination that the department's refusal to recognize the tribe violates the tribe's constitutional guarantee of equal protection under the laws. So they're pointing out that most of these descendants are from Duwamish women, many of which married outside the American Indian population, certainly the Duwamish population. That they're being, and also the fact that the chief of the tribe is a woman. They are arguing as an additional point that there is a bias based on sex discrimination in granting the tribal rights. Well, who agrees with the Duwamish? Gee, I got a zero in organization instead of an O there at the end, but At any rate, if some of you are symphony patrons, when you go to the symphony, you will hear an announcement before the symphony begins. It's pretty close to this. It would be something the Seattle Symphony Organization would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people. Past and present, in honor with gratitude, the land itself, the Duwamish tribe. There are variations of this, and I don't know that this is the exact one that the Seattle Symphony uses, but being a symphony patron myself, it's pretty close. 38 organizations, 9 labor unions, 15 companies, 11 religious organizations, and 10 politicians have signed a variation of this statement. Now, many signees make rental contributions to the tribe after signing the statement. In other words, they sign the statement and then they send monthly dollars to the tribe for rent for the traditional land that they are on. At last report, 4,500 contributors contribute about $20,000 a month in these rental contributions. And just to show that the National Hockey League and the Muckleshoots don't have the total pipeline into Seattle sports, the current chief of the Duwamish threw out the opening day pitch for the Mariners a couple of years ago. Well, here's a setup at, I'm not sure, some sort of a public meeting. They also have a similar setup in the Longhouse where they are encouraging people to become real renters and join in these monthly contributions, recognizing the fact that we are all on Duwamish land. And there's a internet site that you can go to become part of this tradition, so choose. Now, how do the Muckleshoots look at all this? You'd think maybe one Indian tribe would be supportive of another one. Here's their statement from the internet. After 1855, the Duwamish people were forced to leave their ancestral villages around Seattle and moved to designated reservations to preserve their heritage and culture. Today, the vast majority of Duwamish descendants are members of the Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Tulalip, Suquamish, and Lumi tribes. But a small group calling itself the Duwamish Tribal Organization is deceptively using the name of our ancestors in an attempt to appropriate our history and our culture. They persist despite numerous federal court and Interior Department rulings that the Duwamish organization is not an Indian tribe, but rather a small group descending from a handful of early marriages with non-Indian settlers who chose to assimilate rather than move to the reservations established for the Duwamish people. Early marriages with non-Indian settlers, heaven forbid. The Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and Puyallup Indian tribes stand together in opposition to granting the Duwamish organization federal recognition. They are not an Indian tribe, and support for their efforts is an affront to our sovereignty and the culture we have fought so long to preserve. Now, do any of the Indians tribes support the Duwamish? Well, yes, notably the Ada and the Tlingit. But these tribes are mostly located pretty far to the north. In fact, mostly in British Columbia. So to some extent, they don't have a dog in the fight. So for my final slide and final thought, regarding the disagreement between the tribes, is this disagreement about a group of Native Americans calling themselves the Duwamish, attempting to steal culture and history of the true Duwamish tribes, for example, the Muckleshoots and others? Or is it a group of federally recognized tribes not wishing to share the benefits from the Department of Indian Affairs with the newly recognized tribe, the Duwamish? Formal tribal recognition of the Duwamish would allow the tribe to compete with recognized tribes for benefits from the Department of Indian Affairs. It might include the development of a casino, perhaps in close proximity to the Muckleshoot Casino, and perhaps close to the Seattle waterfront. Can you imagine what a gambling site that was adjacent to the Seattle waterfront, what a cash cow that would be. So I leave it to you to express your opinions and see what you have to say about this conflict. That's all I have.
I might point out for those of you who drove to West Seattle when the big bridge was down, that you went by the Longhouse and the Cultural Center on your way. It's buried in an industrial area in West Seattle, but it's there. And as I say, if you did go to West Seattle, you probably saw it, whether you recognized it or not.
To what degree do the tribes rely on outside professional management for the big business operations that they have, the casinos and the bank and whatever?
That's beyond my pay grade.
Another form of culture clash. Lowell and then Jerry.
With regard to May's comment, I think there are two things. One is the recognition of the tribe, and the other is enrollment. And I think there's enrollment in non-recognized tribes.
Yeah.
So that's set up by the tribe itself, what the requirements are for enrollment. And those are two different things, I think.
They are two different things, and there are approximately 600 people who are enrolled in the Duwamish tribe.
So, Don, I don't think it's something that should get necessarily legal status, but is there anything that could be usefully learned from studying some genomes?
I don't think so, because they have already done a great deal of hereditary tracing, so it's generally accepted that the people that are enrolled in the Duwamish tribe do in fact relate back to that original tribe. So the argument is legal technicality, not whether these people are really Duwamish people.
How about trust but verify?
Yeah, verify what though? It's kind of a fiction imposed on a fiction. Okay, may
opinion, but I think we're in a period of reconciliation of what America has done, the American government has done to various groups, whether it's blacks or whatever. And my sense is that the Duwamish were left out of things. I think they should be given some sort of recognition, and whether they're going to be competing with the Muckleshoot, that's, that's the way the cookie crumbles. And by the way, it's Puyallup. That's how you pronounce it.
A rather aggressive stance toward people who are using their land. They often provide opportunities for people to fish on their property, but they have to be approved by the tribe and so on. We were at one location over on the peninsula where they checked us in, and the person who did it was carrying a shotgun. And he was there to make certain that nobody else but those that had permission could come on. If you want to read something that is really moving about how an Indian feels about the changes that are taking place, this was written by somebody in the Tlingit tribe. It's called An Owl. I Heard an Owl Call My Name. It's a beautiful book. I recommend it to you.
Yeah.
The casinos comes from the East. There are a lot of tribes in the eastern U.S. who are applying for recognition who don't have it. I know at least in one case in Virginia that I read about a few years ago. The only tribe I had actually been on their land that I knew was in Connecticut, and one of the early tribes that formed a casino, 30 years ago or so. And the neat thing about that tribe is not just that they had the casino, but about a mile away there was a wonderful museum of their culture and history in Connecticut. And so it was actually one of the best exhibits I've ever seen. They managed to get professional help when they needed it, and whoever was running the tribe was a really good businessman. So not only did they invest in the casino, but they invested in special ferry, special boats from New York to come in, and you could get a car right at the train station to take you right to the gambling, so you didn't miss much, and so forth. So they invested in related activities as well as in the casino itself. So.
I'm seeing hands up, but if I could just make a comment. A lot of this reminds me as in the early 1960s, as a college freshman, I was attracted to the Department of Anthropology and Sociology because they had some interesting professors. And professors' main mission in life, I discovered, is to explode all of the certainties brought in by the incoming freshmen. And one of the interesting things I learned is how foreign the idea of tribe and tribal government and leadership. The United States really had no very clear understanding of how the native people thought of themselves. The idea of tribe was something sort of pasted on, as if it were a nation or a town or something like that, where the organization of those indigenous people was primarily based on kinship. And they allocated the resources and the fishing rights and the rights to hunt and forage based on their family relationships. And it was such an unusual idea that was brought in by the Americans, who automatically assumed that they were going to think exactly like us in how they organized themselves and allocated their resources. So the whole history is based on a huge amount of thick-headed understanding on the part of our government. Let's see.
There was, on the screen, you were talking about, memory, something about the tribes. There was a 10 to 15 year period when the Duwamish were not giving papers or whatever. I thought to myself, but that's our construct, a white construct. I didn't even know if they knew how to write at that point because they weren't getting educational benefits. So why would we expect them to maintain that kind of record keeping that is our heritage, not theirs? Theirs is more verbal. Anyway.
I might mention that the very few public places where one can smoke, all those casinos have smoking. And I think that draws a lot of people in. Of course, it probably repels some people, but now a lot of them have areas that are not smoking. My wife and I went to the Tulalip one, a good restaurant. My wife couldn't stand it outside though because it was so smoky all the time everywhere. Also, the Clearwater one is, I think, it's Squamish. I've been in that one. It's very, very, very smoky when I was there. It was quite some years ago though. I don't know if they probably have a non-smoking area now.
Another form of culture clash. Lowell and then Jerry.
So
So the operational definition to be a member of the Umpqua tribe, which is your application and being registered member, was simply to be within 3 generations. It could be cousins and nephews, but you have to have within 3 generations a true Umpqua tribal member who was registered with the Indian Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they had a census. Everybody was there. And you know what was really interesting when I looked at the census records was how many French names, because in the early 1900s, the French fur trappers were in the region. And so very early we had into sort of assimilation with the Umpqua tribe and the French fur trappers. But 3 generations with the operational definition, and it could be really far. So I don't think a genetic analysis will shed light on this.
Thank you, Dawn, for